Okay, that's football. Okay, that's unnecessary roughness. Now he just ripped his head off. And
his helmet!
And he just hit him.
What? It's like you're wearing a fanny pack.
Alright, I'm gonna go get a haircut. Oh. In order for this transition to work, I'm gonna go this way, and you have to leave now. Oh yes, look at that. Damps Montreal, the best place for a haircut. And you, 1, 2, 3. Oh yeah, what do you think? What do you think? Harsh. Alright, so the question is this. Alright, and I realize I forgot to do the intro and set the context. Viva Frei Montreal litigator turned YouTuber. I'm waiting for family stuff. Alright, so the story is this. The Cleveland Browns defensive end Myles Garrett tackled the Pittsburg Steelers quarterback, what's his name? Mason Rudolph. And not only tackled him savagely and brought him to the ground, he then proceeded to rip off his helmet via the face mask and then club the quarterback over the head with his own helmet. And a lot of people were asking, does this not constitute criminal conduct? And they came to Viva Frei, the YouTube law guy. And this is going to be the vlog answering that question now. And people have been asking it from Philip DeFranco to other people on the internet. Is this not criminal, what the guy did in the football game, taking off someone's helmet and bashing them on the head with it? And the answer is...
it's complicated.
Okay. I got another meeting now, so I will be back in 2 hours to finish this vlog. You know what? We're gonna vlog this one on the road so I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Alright, so the question is, how is this not actual assault in the criminal sense? And the answer is that it might very well be, but before we answer that question, we need to go back to some basics about contact sports. Have you ever wondered why in boxing the boxers are not automatically arrested on assault charges? Boxing, by definition, is assault. And in law, consenting to the assault is not a defense to the assault. Think about that. So how do these combat sports exist without there being de facto assault charges brought, without there being de facto assault charges brought every time an event is held? In most jurisdictions, there are specific legislative provisions that allow for combat sports to be held in the first place. In some jurisdictions like Canada, for example, while there are specific legislative provisions that allow for combat sports, there are also specific legislative prohibitions on certain types of combat sports. And so there are legislative exceptions that allow for that which would otherwise under normal context be illegal. But what about sports like soccer, hockey, football, basketball, where the violence is not intrinsic to the nature of the game per se, but it is just relatively frequent or commonplace in the game itself? Why is it, for example, that players can oftentimes get away with brawls in basketball, fist fights in hockey, bench clearing melees in baseball without criminal charges being pressed? In those cases, the courts have interpreted as a matter of consent to the reasonable possibility of an outcome of certain events given the nature of the sport. If you sign up to play hockey, you can't press charges against someone who hip checks you or body checks you, whereas if you're walking down the street and someone decides to do the same, you can bet sure as sugar that you will press charges. If you agree to play football, you can't press criminal charges if someone gives you the most brutal of all tackles. But if someone does that to you on the street, you can bet that they will get arrested. It is a question of consenting to the inherent or predictable risks of the sport. And oftentimes that does, in fact, depending on the sport and depending on the level, include certain acts of violence that are commonplace to the sport. So it is ultimately a question of consent and expectation. When you sign up for hockey at a professional level, you know you're going to get hip checked, body checked. You even know that you are from time to time going to get into fist fights, even though that is not an inherent part of the game. It may not be a defining feature of the sport like punching to the face is to boxing, but it is, at least in Canada and the States, commonplace in hockey to the point of reasonable expectation. So the real question is, when does it go from an inherent, sort of predictable to be expected part of the sport that one consents to, if not implicitly, explicitly by virtue of contract and by virtue of them playing the sport? And an important thing to appreciate is that this threshold differs depending on the level of the sport itself. That which is an acceptable level of risk of violence in, say, pro NHL hockey might not be the same thing as the over 40 Thursday night league. And the courts have in fact applied the law accordingly. That which is passed in the NHL without generating criminal charges has in fact been recognized as criminal in the league level or in lower levels where you don't expect that level of violence or that level of risk. It all comes down to a question of consent to the reasonable expectation expectations of the level of violence inherent to the sport itself. Even in boxing, where the sport itself is defined by physical assault, the reasonable expectation is not to get sucker punched after a fight is over. And even still in those cases, for example, Paul Daly sucker punching Josh Koscheck after the fight, it's not necessarily going to be treated as a criminal matter, it'll probably just be dealt with internally. But take a couple of infamous examples in hockey where that line gets crossed and where the violence is beyond what anyone could reasonably consent to given the nature of the sport. Todd Bertuzzi sucker punching Steve Moore to the back of the head. Todd Bertuzzi was charged with criminal assault causing bodily harm and pleaded guilty and did 80 hours of community service. Marty McSorley slashing Donald Brashear to the head. He was found guilty of assault with a weapon and sentenced to 18 months probation. So there is a limit in every sport after which the violence is not going to be anything that anyone consented to given the nature or inherent risks of the game. Now let's apply these principles to the case at hand. After my meeting. Before we get to the case at hand, I forgot about one more classic example. Dino Ciccarelli clubbing Luke Richardson in the head with his stick multiple times. Convicted of assault, fined $1,000 and sentenced to 1 day in jail. Now what do we make of the situation at hand? Myles Garrett first takes down the quarterback Mason Rudolph in a very, very rough manner that can only be described as unsportsmanlike. Takes it one step further and rips off the helmet from the face mask. At the very least, what can be described as a personal foul, but then proceeds to use the helmet as what can be described as a mace and smash Mason Rudolph on the head with his own helmet. Now this may actually be the perfect definition of irony, but is it sufficiently egregious that it will qualify as criminal conduct? From the examples we've seen in law as to where the conduct crosses the line from part of the game to criminal conduct, it seems to have actually a lot to do with the consequences of the conduct. In the 3 examples I mentioned in this video, all of which happened to deal with hockey, but just chalk that up to me being Canadian, there were very serious physical consequences from the conduct in question. When Todd Bertuzzi sucker punched Steve Moore was hauled off the ice unconscious, had 3 broken vertebrae, and never played hockey again. When Marty McSorley slashed Donald Brashear to the head, he knocked him unconscious. So it seems to me that a reasonable observation is that the matter will go criminal depending on the severity of the injury caused to the other player as a result of the egregious conduct. Alright, and just to open up one last parenthesis here, this could also be a case of assault with a weapon, because a weapon is determined on a case-by-case basis. Some jurisdictions have things that are called weapons per se, things that are deemed to be weapons like guns and knives. But in other situations, things like golf clubs, baseball bats have been determined to be weapons for the purposes of assault, and who knows, maybe a helmet can be a weapon for the purpose of assault. Alright, back to the video. And as of the making of this video, Myles Garrett has been suspended for the rest of the season, including the postseason, and it seems that there was very little to any injury suffered by Mason Rudolph. So my prediction is that this is not going to go criminal despite all of the negative publicity that this is generating for the NFL, and the authorities are going to leave it to the authority of the NFL to impose the proper sanctions it deems appropriate. But the general rule is that in all sports, even in combat sports, there is a line after which consent can no longer be deemed to apply to certain conduct. One can consent either implicitly or explicitly to certain risks and conduct inherent in certain sports without necessarily thinking that they are going to get knocked over the head with their own helmet after it has been ripped from their face. But despite the egregious, over-the-top nature of this conduct, I don't think the authorities are going to get involved in this particular case because there was no lasting serious injury sustained by Mason Rudolph. They're likely just going to leave the appropriate sanction to be administered by the NFL itself. Although, to quote the youth of this generation, this is not necessarily a good look for the NFL. Incidentally, if you want to see another video I made on the inherent risk that spectators agree to by attending certain events, I'll link that video right here. And if you like my video and my content, be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop a comment in the comment section, support the channel either through PayPal, which is up in the banner, or buy some merch, links below, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!